They said your name in that room, and you weren't there to defend yourself. You found out later, maybe through a text, maybe through the silence that replaced the hugs, maybe through the expression on someone's face at Sunday service that told you the verdict had already been decided. Quietly, unanimously, without you. And something inside you broke in a way that's almost impossible to explain to people who have never sat in a church parking lot, gripping a steering wheel, asking God whether he was also done with you. Because here's what no one says out loud about spiritual abuse in church. When the people carrying Bibles turn against you, the wound isn't just social, it's theological. When your leaders whisper your name in hallways, when a business meeting becomes a quiet tribunal with you as the subject, something in your brain starts to whisper back. If the shepherds say I'm the problem, maybe God thinks so too. And tonight, there is a weight on your chest you don't have a name for, that specific heaviness sitting at the base of your ribs. Stay with me, because what I'm about to show you doesn't just explain what happened, it reframes it completely. Every day you carry the label they assigned you, divisive, spiritually immature, not submitted, too much, not enough, that label is doing something invisible to your identity. It is slowly replacing who God declared you to be with who they needed you to be for their system to keep functioning without examining itself. That is not a spiritual discipline, that is a mechanism, and it has a name older than psychology. In the book of Leviticus, chapter 16, the Day of Atonement, there is a ritual that barely gets a full sermon anywhere. 2 goats were brought before the high priest. The first was sacrificed on the altar. The second, called the scapegoat, in Hebrew the goat for Exile, had the accumulated sins and failures of the entire community placed on its head through the laying on of hands. Every unresolved wound, every denied wrongdoing, everything the community refused to own, placed on one animal's back. And then it was driven out into the wilderness, alone. Not because it was guilty, because the system needed it gone. The people walked home feeling clean. The goat walked into the desert carrying weight that was never its own. Does any part of that feel familiar? Now look at the pattern across Scripture, because it never appears just once. Joseph, thrown into a pit by the very brothers who should have celebrated what God placed in him, later sold, later imprisoned. The people closest to him were the ones who couldn't survive his presence without becoming uncomfortable with themselves. Elijah, the most powerful prophetic voice of his generation, sitting under a broom tree in the wilderness, begging God to end his life, not because God abandoned him. Because the religious and political machinery of his era had made him its target, and he ran. Not from cowardice, from exhaustion that comes from being the one person a toxic system refuses to stop hunting. David, already anointed king by the prophet Samuel, running from the very institution designed to protect Israel, hiding in caves, writing psalms of abandonment, while the one supposed to shepherd God's people treated him like a threat to be neutralized. And then, the one who makes the pattern impossible to dismiss, Jesus, betrayed in a garden by someone who had walked with him for 3 years, tried in a religious court by the very theological system he came to fulfill, convicted not of any crime but of being exactly who he was in front of people who needed him to be less, driven outside the city walls. Crucified beyond the gate, the ultimate scapegoat, the last one the system would ever need. This pattern is not accidental, it is ancient, and it is purposeful. Here is the thing about the Leviticus scapegoat that changes the entire story. The goat wasn't chosen because it was dirty. It was chosen because it could carry the weight and survive the wilderness. And the community didn't drive it out because it was weak. They drove it out because keeping it inside meant confronting everything they refused to face. Your presence was making something visible that the institution needed to keep invisible. That is not your shame to carry, that is your discernment they couldn't afford. But here's why the rejection still feels like grief even when you know you didn't deserve it, and this is what spiritual trauma recovery has to address honestly. Researchers who study trauma bonding describe what happens when you've invested your identity, your language, your sense of God, your deepest community into a structure that later turns on you. The wound isn't just relational. You lose a framework, you lose a vocabulary for prayer. You lose friendships that felt like covenant but turned out to be conditional on your compliance. You lose the version of yourself that existed inside that community, and even when that version was diminished, even when it cost you, losing it is still a death. And there is grief in that loss. The kind that has no clean bottom, that resurfaces on random Tuesdays and quietly devastating Sundays. That makes you wonder if you'll ever be able to sit in a church building again without your nervous system preparing for impact. That heaviness you're carrying tonight, that specific weight, it is not God's silence. It is not divine disappointment wearing your name. It is the feeling of a structure collapsing around you while God holds the ceiling long enough for you to walk out before it falls completely. The wilderness is not the punishment. It is the passage. What if, and I need you to truly stay with this, what if God allowed you to be the church scapegoat not because he agreed with what they said, but because he needed to get you out of a place that was about to collapse under the weight of its own unaddressed wounds? Toxic religious systems don't just hurt people. They need someone to absorb their collective dysfunction so they don't have to change. And when the person they chose for that role starts asking questions, seeing patterns, or simply refusing to shrink one more time, the system doesn't reform. It expels. But here is what expulsion reveals. Elijah didn't stay under the broom tree. The angel came, touched him, said, "Get up. The journey ahead is too great for you to face without being fed." And then God met him not in the fire, not in the earthquake, but in the still small voice, in the quiet that only exile produces. You are not the problem they labeled you as. You are the evidence of what that community refused to become, and that is not your burden anymore. Healing from spiritual abuse and church rejection isn't only about processing what was done to you. It is about recovering the identity the institution tried to replace with a verdict. Your value was never contingent on their vote in that room. Your access to the Father was never mediated by their approval. You were a child of God before you walked through those doors. You remain a child of God in this wilderness. The exile is not the destination. It is the desert road that leads to the Father's table. And I want to give you something specific for tonight, something you can do in the exact weight you're carrying right now. This is what I call the prayer of the exile, not a performance, not a formula, just words spoken from a wilderness to a Father who was listening before you even formed the thought. You can say this out loud or simply hold it in your chest. Father, I release the verdict they gave me. I am not what they needed me to be for their system to survive. I release every tie that bound my identity to a community that required my silence to feel holy. Restore to me the name you gave me before they ever said mine in that room. Lead me through this wilderness. I trust that what is ahead is greater than what I am leaving behind. You are still my shepherd, and I am still your child. If something shifted while you prayed that, even slightly, even quietly, don't explain it away. That is not emotion performing itself. That is the beginning of healing from spiritual rejection that was never yours to carry. You didn't find this video by accident tonight, and you didn't come here alone.